fait une année déjà que nous sommes là. Et on a voulu marquer l'événement avec tous nos amis, tous nos clients, tous ceux qui étaient avec nous dans cette année-là. Parce que grâce à vous, grâce à nos amis, nos clients, à tout le monde qui est là, les employés, on a fait beaucoup de chemin ensemble. Et je pense que c'était bien de se voir, pas nécessairement au tribunal, pas nécessairement dans le bureau. Aujourd'hui, avec l'évolution, l'homme de loi ne peut pas rester cloîtré dans son petit bureau. On doit aller au-delà de là. C'est pas, l'homme de loi n'est pas seulement pour aller au Tsato, je vais aller en cours, au tribunal et tout le reste, non. On est plus partie prenante des activités de nos clients, être plus proche de vous, à tous les niveaux, qui n'ont pas à attendre qu'il y ait un problème pour revenir vers nous. Et c'est pour cela qu'on a voulu prendre contact avec vous, partager avec vous certains problèmes que nous avons, que nous faisons face. Et dans ce contexte-là, que nous avons choisi de mettre dans ce séminaire, nous avons deux sessions au cet après-midi. On va être ce matin, une session, une autre session. Dans la première session, nous aurons notre ami Janesh et Tania qui vont être les modérateurs. Ils vont présenter bien sûr les panélistes et le sujet qu'ils vont développer avec vous. J'espère que vous avez passé un bon moment avec nous. Je vous remercie.
I have the pleasure of hosting Evita Fakun, Chief Sustainability Officer at the Lux Collective. She's also the Vice Chair of the Board of the United Nations Global Compact for Mauritius and Indian Ocean. Soll, Chief Investment Officer at Summit Africa, a specialist alternatives investment management firm. Unfortunately, Pascale Leonide could not make it today due to health reasons, but she has very kindly sent through some pre-recorded videos. So just as background, Pascale is CEO and founder of PL Consulting Limited, an ESG consultancy and commercial structuring firm. And last but not least, my colleague Janesh Chuttoo, also a partner in the transactions department at Orison. So without further ado, let's dive right in. We'll cover 4 topics today. So the first one will be on the regulatory framework, before moving to the reporting standards, how to implement ESG on a day-to-day basis, and lastly we'll cover greenwashing. So as everybody is surely aware, ESG is no longer a niche area and has over the years become an integral part of how companies operate. The principle of people, planet, profits, also known as the triple bottom line, has permeated across all levels of decision making. And this is due to the increased pressures from stakeholders, employees, shareholders, and a wider business community in general. So as an introduction, I'll start off by briefly summarizing the main points of the ESG framework in Mauritius. In terms of the E, we have the Environment Protection Act, which provides that environment impact assessments or preliminary environment reports should be conducted before undertaking certain types of large-scale projects. And under the Act, we have a number of regulations for the reduction of the use of plastic, incentivizing the use of renewable energy, mitigating noise pollution, and so on. We also have the Climate Change Act, which was promulgated recently, and this is more of a framework on national policies and strategic action plans to be taken by the government in the context of the Paris Agreement. In terms of the S, companies are more than well versed with the plethora of obligations under the Workers' Rights Act, the Equal Opportunities Act, and the Occupational Health and Safety Act. Prohibition on modern slavery is enshrined in Section 6 of our Constitution, and CSR programs have been around for quite a long time. In terms of the G, the Companies Act provides that at least one woman should sit on the board of directors of public companies. Then we also have the Financial Intelligence and Anti-Money Laundering Act and corresponding regulations. And as the name suggests, it sets out the framework on measures to be taken concerning anti-money laundering and the countering of financial terrorism. The National Code of Corporate Governance and the Scorecard, although it's not hard law, so to speak, a number of companies have adhered to its principles. And on the ESG aspect in particular, Principle 6 relates to reporting with integrity. As a quick refresher, that principle states that the board should present a fair, balanced, and understandable assessment of the company's ESG position, performance, and outlook on the annual report and also on the website. In terms of sectoral rules and regulations, the Bank of Mauritius and the Financial Services Commission have issued guidelines on the issue of sustainable bonds and also on the issue of green and corporate bonds. And those are modeled on the ICMA's recon principle. Recently, the Bank of Mauritius has also issued additional guidelines concerning how banks should implement climate-related and environmental financial risk management measures throughout their internal processes. And last but not least, we have the SEMSI that tracks the price performance of listed companies that demonstrate very strong sustainability practices. So now we'll move on to the first topic. I'm going to take the financial services industry as example, as it's been at the forefront of acceleration towards adherence with ESG principles and has somewhat set the pace for increased transparency and reporting. So we've seen a couple of trends emerge lately, and the first one relates to the shift from voluntary disclosure, and slowly it's been shifting to mandatory disclosures. So among a few examples, the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation applies to categories of financial market participants, and that will cover asset managers, pension fund providers, insurers and banks. And under this regulation, participants are mandated to disclose ESG factors with a view to enable investors to make informed decisions on financial instruments. At the end of the day, the regulation aims to mitigate greenwashing on financial advice and financial products in the European Union. Next example, most large companies are now required in England since April of this year to make climate-related financial disclosures in the annual report in accordance with TCFD recommendations. And in France, they've adopted the Energy Transition for Green Growth Law, which again applies to the financial services industry, where the disclosure of climate risk, is mandatory. The second trend relates to the shift from regulating the financial services sector and more widely towards the business community in general. A couple of examples here again. India has introduced ESG reporting for the top 1,000 listed companies. This was initially done on a voluntary basis for the past year, 2021-2022, and has now become mandatory for 2022-2023. Similarly, in the UK, listed companies should provide a report disclosing GHG emissions, human rights issues, and diversity policies, amongst other topics, in accordance with the Companies Act, Strategic and Directors Report regulations. So my first question to the panelists would be on what are your thoughts concerning regulation in Mauritius, especially concerning the E? Do you think that we should follow the same trend of adopting voluntary disclosures first, and that will give companies time to hop on board and move slowly towards mandatory disclosures? Or should we start regulating and imposing mandatory disclosures at the outset? So, Evita, would you like to take this question?
Can you hear me? Hi everyone, well thank you for inviting me to participate in this discussion. I think you've answered a lot of the questions already. Your research is amazing, on point. But from UN Global Compact perspective, we noticed that so they've prepared a new format for reporting, because companies that are signatories or participants, they have to publish a report on the 4 pillars of UN Global Compact, so human rights, labor rights, anti-corruption, environment, but the format was sort of freestyle. And now they've realized that it's a bit of they are being used for greenwashing, basically. So you've got even the world's, biggest polluters, capped by consumers, not by research, who are participants in the Global Compact, and that sort of creates a very counterproductive system. So they've come up with a format that aligns with GRI, and something that I thought was very striking is they ask the company to report on whether the board has signed off on the goals, the sustainability goals of the company, not on the sustainability report, because that's what you see with GRI. You just put a statement in the chairman's notes, and then in the CEO's comments, he will mention sustainability, but it's like it's not their problem. But now your Global Compact is pushing it further, and we want to see accountability at the highest level, where it should be.
Thank you. And Hannes, would you like to comment on this question?
Good afternoon, everyone. I think a lot of my comments might border on controversial when it comes to ESG, only because I think there's a practical implementation to this major shift that's coming down the line. And ESG has come about because you've got BP having an oil spill in Mexico, or in Brazil, a major dam will break. And so they set these high standards, and then they want to ripple it all the way down to the smallest businesses. So in our private equity fund, we invest in a lot of these businesses. And you then say, how do you adopt all these standards? And we'll touch on some of them today, and they're super complex, really, really complex. And so if we look at implementing standards within a country like Mauritius, you almost say to yourself, well, there has to be a focus on specific elements. Because if we adopt the European standards, we'll miss it. Because when you look at your CO2 emissions, you ranked 140 out of 209. It's 0.1% of the world. However, when it looks to clean water, which is a key sustainable development goal, it's a major issue. Water is a shortage in Mauritius. If you look at your underwater and your fish supply, it's a major issue in Mauritius. So Mauritius is going to set legislation that has to really make it bespoke to its country. And it's the one thing all the emerging economies are really struggling with. So when you look at CO2 emissions reporting in the Netherlands, every company there has to report on all levels of CO2 emission. And so everyone can ratchet it up, and we'll touch on it maybe a bit later. But I think that legislation in Mauritius, in particular around E, has to focus on what the country needs, rather than adopting an international standard and just pushing it down the line, because that's the current process when it comes to ESG internationally. We all run with these big standards and then we ripple it down. But ESG is there to change conduct that impacts people and planet, not focus on things that don't. And for that, it's going to really call for a very refined lens in how regulators implement it and enforce it.
Thank you. Can you also show Pascale's video, please?
If I may attempt to reply to your question, I would tend to say that a voluntary disclosure framework on the E aspect of ESG will definitely encourage businesses to start looking into the environmental impact of their operations. But with the recent undeniable consequences of climate change we've seen over the past few months, I think it has become urgent to address this by adopting a mandatory disclosure framework. We are actually seeing a general shift towards mandatory disclosures, and I think that this has been driven by visual and tangible crisis. So you will all recall the forest fires we've seen on television in Europe over the past few months, and even in California, and more recently the floods in Pakistan. I think that these are actually putting an enormous pressure on states to report on their obligations and commitments made on the E aspect of ESG, although the war in Ukraine, especially the sanctions on Russia, have also contributed in accelerating the green transition for the G7 countries. Here in Mauritius, the Climate Change Act already sets obligations on reporting by Mauritius under the UN and under other frameworks like the Kyoto Protocol or the Paris Agreement. So in my view, a mandatory disclosure framework for companies would only help and make sense in order for governments to obtain at national level accurate data and reporting from businesses on the E aspect of ESG. Thank you.
So, Evita, you've indicated that at the Global UN Compact, you've proposed the GRI as a mandatory form of disclosure. Do you think that if Mauritius adopts a mandatory framework in terms of E, especially locally, do you think that it makes sense to have a regulatory body, and do we go as far as to impose sanctions?
Well, it really depends on what kind of environmental KPIs we're talking about, but I believe that GHG is the one that is going to connect us all and provide sufficient data for drafting national policies and deciding what is the boundary for sanctioning. So what is the size of the organizations that have to report and the size of organizations that get away with it? But do you have maybe gradual steps or gradual disclosure levels for different sizes of organizations and different types? And what is your impact locally? What is your impact internationally? Because I don't think that we should come back to us as being just Mauritius and prepare our own little standard. I think it's important to connect with international standards because we are, after all, a human member state. So it's important to use best practices from international organizations and use that in order to decide how to sanction as well. A regulatory body, absolutely, but they should be regulated as well, because that's important, that's something we don't see enough. So someone who will come and decide whether you are sustainable or not, or your report is according to the norms, they also need to be audited and to be assessed by international bodies. That's what we see with sustainability certifications in tourism, for example. So we will opt for certifications that are themselves from bodies that are audited by a global council.
Thank you. And Hannes, what would be your views on this?
Look, I think regulatory bodies always are essential to implement standards, but they're only as good as the reporting that goes with that. And the big thing around ESG is it's not about the standard. It's not about reporting on the standard. It's how does a company implement the standard that delivers an outcome which makes the world a better place. The interesting thing is that when you sit on some of these international organizations, I sit on a couple of them, when we talk about ESG in companies, and we talk about the regulations and the enforcement of that regulation, we often come back to how do you do it? What is the cost associated with it, and how do we make it practical? So regulators could easily say, there's international, we have to work to standards, and we'll talk to those because in our business we belong to almost all of them. The thing is that the regulators need to be cognizant of what it takes to implement it, and that shift is a major thing within the world right now, in particular in the emerging economies. So to aspire for something is the absolute crest that we need to. Regulators need to keep in mind that companies are at different levels of progression. I mean, I can tell you BP have got a couple of hundred people in the ESG department. If I had to go to Leonide now and ask them how many, you guys can ask that question. But their risk, and I'll touch on that later, is one of the highest risks for ESG on the whole island, hospitals. And so regulators need to always keep that in mind, but I think regulators are essential in the driving of this down the line. And there has to come a point where it has to be enforced. But we have to help companies get through that journey. But the enforcement is as good as the reporting standard. And the adoption of it, and the country being able to collect the data and enforce against that. And that's another big thing for countries to wrestle with.
Thank you. Thank you. We'll also have a look at what Pascale has to say on this topic.
I would say that a mandatory disclosure framework would definitely have the direct consequence of the need to have a supervisory authority oversight with powers to impose fines or remedial actions, for instance, for compliance with a set framework. I think over and above that, it is very important that the supervisory authority's personnel be independent and free from any conflict. So this will help ensure the independence and impartiality from the supervised entities. We've seen under the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence EU Directive that this framework relies both on an administrative oversight and judicial enforcement through civil liability. And coming back to our national level requirements on the E aspect of ESG, again, we've seen under the Climate Change Act that this act provides for a specific sanctions regime for any person for not complying with the obligations under the act. So let's see how all this falls into play when the framework is duly implemented. But I must admit that this is a big first step for Mauritius on the E aspect. Thank you.
So the next question is to you, Janesh. How do you see the evolution of disclosures in general, especially Mauritius? Are we going to start hopping on board concerning that?
Look, I think that there has to be a compliance to the standard. I don't think that countries should play around with it, and I'm certainly not purporting that that should be the consequence of focused attention. The question is, what standards do you adopt? Because I know one of the questions I relate to that, you touched on that, but there's so many. How do you adopt that is going to be the key thing, I think, in terms of that standard. But I do believe it's an absolute must. But there hasn't been one country in the world that has prescribed a standard. And when you go and speak to the big investment managers in the world, they've gone and picked standards. And so the people that control money have already made calls. BlackRock, $10 trillion. $10 trillion, they've chosen their standards. Something like 8,000 companies involved in that whole process. They've gone and said, we'll align to the standard. The thing that I grapple with is what will become a common norm, and how do you report to that common norm, and how do countries then get held accountable to that common norm. So I think there's the Paris Accord, which will kind of align to that to some extent, but some countries will just naturally pass it. Seychelles, Mauritius, because they're the greenhouse gases. It's not a manufacturing thing. They'll almost be okay. So then where does the next attention go? Because if I was sitting in a ministry, I'd say, where does my country desperately need to? I'm contributing to greenhouse gases. I'm okay. So where's the next focus? How do we report on that, how we do that? But then the biggest problem that everyone's facing is a lot of companies are multinationals. And that just brings in an increased level of complexity within that. So if you had a major multinational here and they're compliant, so does Mauritius regulate them on a national level, or do each of the subcontinents? And that's, I think, a big thing that the world has to grapple with in terms of how do we pull this together. Because if the outcome is not meaningful, it will not achieve the end result. And I think that's the thing that everyone is grappling with at the moment. In all the committees that I do sit on, it's around these questions: the how, to what extent, and what are the pitfalls? How do we work through it practically? And I think those are challenges we are facing at the moment. But I do believe countries have to have standards and alignments. And so maybe just in final, the question will be, does a parliament sit and say, we will apply all our companies to the global compact? And so then that's it. Or is it the GRI? Or is it SASB? And the list goes on.
Thank you. So we're going to touch upon some of those reporting standards in the next topic. So the next topic is on specifically reporting standards. When you go through the granular aspects, what amounts to green is not harmonized on a regional, national, or global basis. Finding a single definition for each sector activity would be a very complex exercise. So, as Janesh has mentioned, there are a wide variety of reporting standards that exist. Some of them are quite general in nature and can apply across different sectors, different businesses. Others are more focused and targeted towards certain kinds of activities. So again, a couple of examples. There's the UN SDGs, which appear to be the most commonly used set of reporting standards in Mauritius, based on the annual reports and sustainability reports available. GRI, which I understand is another very popular set due to its modular formula. In terms of targeted reporting standards, there's the UN Principle of Reporting Investments, which targets sustainable investments as a whole. And recently, the IFRS has also hopped on board and announced the creation of its own International Sustainability Standards Board to regulate accounting disclosures. And in line with this, the board will coordinate with the GRI's Global Sustainability Standards Report on work programs and initiatives. So my next set of questions is addressed to you, Hannes. Based on your experience, what would be the most commonly used set on global standard, and what kind of trends have you identified?
So this is a properly loaded question. So the big one that people talk about is the GRI. In Mauritius, 5 companies report on the GRI, only 5. In the Netherlands, the country that's considered one of the leaders in its field, only 21 companies. Why? Because firstly, you have to pay to be part of that reporting framework. Depending on your size, you can get up to $20,000, $30,000. And it's a complex environment which requires high skilled people, but it's a brilliant framework. Then you've got TCFD that you could look at. You've got the CDP, Carbon Development Program, which a lot of people have aligned to relative to that reporting standards. Then we've got IFRS that we've just heard that has partnered with what's called the Sustainable Accounting Standards Board. Started by Michael Bloomberg and a team 12 years ago that went and created a standard which was adopted by BlackRock, and Larry Fink in his letter to all the companies they invest in said, you either adopt the standard or we disinvest. That's the power of money in enforcing ESG. But they adopted SASB relative to it, and so those are the standards. So if you look at the standards which our company we're signed up to SASB. We signed up to GENE, which is the Global Impact Investment Network. It's for investment managers. IRIS, which is the Impact Reporting and Impact Standards, Investment Reporting and Impact Standards. We look at TCFD within our frameworks and we report through on that. We're obviously members of the PRI. But I can tell you all of these organizations are grappling with getting data, reporting data and making it usable. I'll give an example. The PRI has got about 2,500 investment managers, banks, or people that have money on it. They released their reports for our end of year 2020 today. They couldn't get the reporting right for a period of 16 months because they really struggled. The data is overwhelming that you pass through to these guys. What do I think are some of the better standards and what we've adopted? There's not a word, better is the wrong word, usable standards. Firstly, the IFC performance standards, hardly ever spoken of in general public. However, if you go speak to a body of 1,000 ESG experts, they'll all start with the IFC performance standards. Every company that builds a proper ESG framework adopts the IFC performance standard. It existed way before ESG became an acronym to the world, and today a common phrase all over. IFC performance standards has got 8 performance standards. They're absolutely brilliant and they're practical for companies to implement. That's the thing that really matters. Performance standard 1, for example, is risk management. Risk management, they've got 9 elements in risk management, and that goes to policy setting in a business. It goes to risk evaluation in a business. But you're evaluating risks at the same things that the GRI looks at, the Global Compact looks at, etc. So if the IFC performance standards is a brilliant standard, you don't need to pay for it. SASB is another brilliant standard, and that's why IFRS and SASB have partnered. Now, in SASB, they've got all these various codes. So they've analyzed basically 15 sectors, 77 industries, and in that they have based on, for example, they analyzed 3,000 hospitals and said, what are the most probable risks around environmental, social capital, human capital, leadership and governance, and business innovation on all these sectors. So when you invest in a hospital, we invest in hospitals, they'll tell you what are the most likely risks you can have. So interestingly, on the ESG scale, hospitals are some of the highest risks in the world. because it's people. People, nurses, the impact of a needle stepping clinic, etc., etc. SASB is brilliant, but it costs $20,000 a year to belong to SASB. So it's not a cheap standard to align to. All these standards you pay, the PRI you pay. But when you belong to them, you disclose that you belong to them and you declare it, and then you in what I call the trade law. The reporting standards are incredibly strenuous at all levels. And so we invest in hospitals, we invest in universities, and we invest in big financial services companies. And we have to track data from all these companies. We've got a team just tracking data, ESG data, because that's what it takes. And that's not even where our work lies. Our work lies into enabling investments, companies, to adopt ESG practices. We're not concerned about the output. We're concerned about the behavior of our companies. Is our hospital looking after a nurse that could have a needle stick incident? Are they disposing of medical waste in appropriate manner so it won't damage the environment? We're far less concerned about saying, oh, I've managed to achieve this. You'll achieve that by default. And that's the shift of ESG that will come. Because people will very soon learn to write data is easy, and to manipulate the viewer of the data is simple. Greenwashing, you can take the best of them. That's why Elon Musk said, ours total got a better ESG rating on the New York Stock Exchange than Tesla. Ask yourself the question, how do they get that right? But go look at their ratings. The Tesla's nowhere compared to Total. Total is like the demigod of ESG. And you go, and so the point is the practical implementation. So the standards that we believe that are very good. GRI is brilliant. Global Compact is brilliant. SASB is brilliant. The IFC performance standards is the standard. And so why do I say I come back to the IFC? One of the big things that when people give you money to invest, so one of our investors is the UK government. British International invests with us. So when they did their ESG reviews on it, they asked for all our ESG processes. One of the fundamental questions is, can you show us your mapping of your standards with all the other world standards? So we've got a spreadsheet that says, here's the SASB standards, it's mapped to these codes in the IFC performance standards, in the Sustainable Development Goals, in the GRI, and we map it all the way through. So we could say, if we adopt these standards, we're technically ticking off all these boxes. But again, when choosing standards, it's about the outcome of doing good. Why do I like the Sustainable Accounting Standards Board? That's really ripping through the world, and it will become one of the big pillars. Is because the standard was developed for the following reason. It identified the risks on environment, social, human, and the business, where the impact could have a financial outcome that will damage the business. So it protects investor money in that process, and in that they use sustainability to drive it. It's the real definition of what we're trying to achieve overall. But it's a balanced scorecard. It's not just about saying, my greenhouse gases are this. Well, then talk to us about what good you're doing with your money on the other side. What lives are you impacting? What planet principles? And so it took us 24 months of research to choose our standards. We then signed up to all these organizations. We've reported a few times through on them. All I can say is this. So our fund, I can say, was, so we were awarded the #1 private equity fund for impact and ESG in Africa. I can only say this, it changed our behavior for good. I'm the biggest advocate of adapting standards. We force it in all our companies we invest. All our companies have to subscribe to SASB, or they don't get our money. They have to adopt the principles we adhere to with the PRI, or they don't get their money. They have to report to us on their greenhouse gases, or they won't get their money. Get our money for investment. The standards change behavior. I am the biggest believer, and will stand on every stage and say, we changed because of this process. And I could see the outcome of what we can achieve by getting it right. But that having been said, it's a nightmare to implement and get right.
Thank you. You've indirectly touched upon this earlier, which is sustainability arbitrage. And it's a term that I've come across in my research, and And indeed, commentators are criticizing this practice when companies intentionally cherry-pick the reporting standard. And this is quite dangerous because it can lead to a race towards the bottom. So what would be your recommendations for companies to avoid that kind of trap?
The interesting thing is if you adopt, so if I adopt SASB and I invest in healthcare, SASB's got a set of reporting standards for healthcare. There's no deviation from it. That's why IFRS is partnered with SASB. Because if you're a financial company or if you're a company that invests in hospitals, or you're a school, or you're a manufacturing facility, or a mine, and the 77 industries are there, there's these set codes that you report against. And there's no deviation from it. And the codes are finite. So that when you go into the SASB reporting, and it's fairly intense, it's got layer of just one line. And you have to pass all that data up the line. So, but then again, not everyone's forced to adapt SASB. If IFRS becomes a standard and says SASB is in, that's a major part of the world, as we know. If GARP goes and says, which is only the other financial kind of reporting standard, then you'd say, okay, now the world will start becoming a calm place. And that's how we avoid cherry picking. The challenge we face, though, is that ESG is becoming a mainstream thing now, but there's this whole thing called impact and sustainability, and people try and bring them together, and they're not the same things, because I can be a good ESG person but not necessarily deliver impact as it's defined internationally. And impact is where you say, so what we have to do is we say, if we take 1.6 billion, we will deploy it in a manner that delivers these results. We will build 10 new hospitals. We would have 7,000 patients go through it. We will invest in universities. Those universities will produce so many students, and within 2 years, they will have jobs by this percentage. There you declare your impact and people measure you. That's not how everyone is. The problem is this is becoming clouded. So people pick the things they want to present so they look better. And everyone goes, well, that's great. But that's not how it should be. I think the only way we're going to avoid the greenwashing process is really about setting a standard. Everyone reports to that standard, but then how do you collect the data? We saw at the PRI, only 2,200 investment managers. And this is the PRI. They're arguably the bigger player in the space, and they couldn't produce the data output. It was a nightmare. And I think that's going to be the next big challenge, because greenwashing is only as good as setting the principle, measuring the principle, holding people accountable.
Thank you. So we'll now move on to the next topic, which goes back to the first one which we discussed, concerning the regulation of the wider business community. So over and above the general obligations that we spoke of earlier, it's interesting to note that in certain jurisdictions, companies' legislation has been specifically amended to integrate ESG factors when it comes to directors' duties. So I'll give a couple of examples about this. The Section 172 of the English Companies Act deals with the directors' duties to promote the success of the company by acting in good faith, but it specifically makes reference to a list of factors, and this would include the impact on the interests of the company's employees, the need to foster the company's business relationship with suppliers and customers, and the company's operations on the community, but also on the environment. ESG principles are similarly enshrined in the Section 166 of the Indian Companies Act, which deals with a similar good faith requirement, and it makes specific reference to directors having to promote not only the objects of the company for the benefit of its members, but also for the benefit of the employees, the community, and the protection of the environment. So, turn at the top is clearly key. Janesh, do you think the time has come for our Companies Act to incorporate similar provisions?
When one reads our Companies Act, it becomes very clear that the focus of directors' duties are actually owed to the companies. So, of course, there are certain exceptions, very few exceptions actually, in the Companies Act, where the director owes certain duties to creditors on insolvency, certain duties to employees and fairly lately certain duties to shareholders, but they are very sparse. So it actually makes sense, and it is also desirable that these changes, what you have highlighted with regard to the jurisdictions, that is England, France and India, that we have a similar approach and an amendment is made to our Companies Act. But I think a standalone amendment to our Companies Act is not enough. What I mean by that is we need to have a holistic approach. So for example, having rules and regulations that target a particular sector that needs to be regulated. So that particular sector, through those rules and regulations, will have particular metrics that are attached, that apply, that tie into that particular sector. So then, obviously, when a particular company is operating in that particular sector, the director would then, by default, need to apply those principles and make sure that the duties that are owed to the company also encompass application of those metrics through those rules and regulations. So a holistic approach is very important. Why I am saying that? Because for us to have accountability, you need to have certainty and clarity. So the rules of the game need to be very clear at the very outset. To all intents and purposes, actually, Pascale touched upon the Climate Change Act 2021 that we have passed in Mauritius, and also you yourself. So, actually, the Climate Change Act is just, to me right now, it's a roadmap that actually paves the national objectives, policies, guidelines, etc., that will need to be adhered to as part of the Paris Agreement. What is interesting to note, actually, is a couple of months back, in July 2020, the United Nations General Assembly actually voted on a resolution stating that access to clean, healthy and sustainable environment is actually a basic human right. So this is actually a call to action for all the member states of the United Nations and all the particular organizations or economic actors operating within that particular jurisdiction to which the member state is a member of the UN. And it actually ties everything in just to make sure that those companies will need to adhere to those standards sooner rather than later. So the way I see it is, yes, an amendment to the Companies Act is desirable, not a standalone amendment. Holistic approach is definitely necessitated, is demanded, and actually it needs to happen sooner rather than later, because we need that.
Thank you. Pascale has also provided her views from a consultant perspective. Let's see what she has to say about this.
I think that this will definitely start the change in corporate and directorship engagement towards the free component of ESG. But again, I think that it's also important to actually devise a framework within which the companies would need to report on the ESG considerations in their annual report. And secondly, that the directors understand the extent of their liability and their obligations vis-à-vis their stakeholders on the ESG reporting. So in my opinion, this will help bring environmental and social considerations to the fore and also remove the option for companies to just pursue profits at the expense of workers, at the expense of communities and nature. Thank you.
So my next question is to you again, Janesh. Clearly, you and Pascale have probed for the amendment of the Companies Act to integrate those kind of ESG factors. In the meantime, whilst hopefully waiting for the legislator to integrate those kind of amendments, do you think that our courts would be willing to take a wide interpretation, or would it simply limit itself to the restricted language that currently exists?
So what we need to understand is that the courts actually give a purposive approach to legislation. So basically, they interpret what is the purpose, why the legislator has actually proclaimed this particular law. So if you look at the cursus of our Supreme Court with regard to directors' duties and how they have interpreted it in light of the Companies Act, it is quite clear that they have focused actually on the breach of directors' duties that are owed to the company, which is very important over here. So it actually ties in with what I said earlier, based on section 143, subsection 1 of the Companies Act, that the duties that directors will actually owe to the company. We'll take two examples over here. So for example, we have the case of Vitribu Limited against Okim 2012, and also the case of Infinity BPO against Buyo to the 2013 Supreme Court judgment, which provide actually good examples behind the principles that have motivated the court's judgment. So, and the approach actually in articulating the prime purpose behind the company's reason to exist in that judgment was actually had a very overwhelming commercial purpose behind it. So, in short, what is the reason behind the company's existence? It has a very much commercial flavor, commercial motive behind it. So, I think the courts would be very reluctant to step into the shoes of the legislator to actually stretch the ambit of section 143, subsection 1 of the Companies Act, to provide for commitments to the society, to do good to the environment, etc., where the legislator actually intended, when the Companies Act was drafted initially, that the whole purpose would be duties of directors owed to the company.
Thank you. So my next question is to Evita from a practical perspective. What would be your top 3 recommendations for companies to live and breathe ESG, so to speak?
I think from a practical perspective, as you said, is, as Anis said, it's becoming confusing to pick a standard. It's becoming confusing for people to look at a report and look at the next and find consistency. And so UN Global Compact is not a reporting standard. UN Global Compact is a set of principles that guides private sector. It's an initiative specific to the private sector, and the 4 pillars that they've selected as being the priority areas for every business to look at are precisely the areas where businesses are violating human rights, are violating environmental rights, are violating ethics, so they are corrupt. And that's what UN Global Compact says is where a company needs to look at in order to be able to be sustainable first, before talking about CSR or tree planting or whatever cosmetic thing that we hear these days. So from a practical perspective, it would be smart for a company to look at just these 4 pillars first. That's where you start. And then when you've got UN Global Compact recommending using GRI standards, that's precisely because GRI is the most widely used standard in the world. So if we use that standard, the more we use it, the more they are going to fine-tune it, the more we are going to give feedback on what works and doesn't work. I'll be clear on that, I'm biased, I'm a member of the GRI Stakeholder Council on the only Mauritian. But I'm exposed to several multinationals, other sectors, other people from academia, not just in Mauritius, who are going to keep pushing GRI and the GSSB to fine-tune the standards so that it becomes something that is practical for us in business. Because I'm not just on the Stakeholder Council, I'm a user of the standards where I work. My company is a member of GRI, and that's voluntary. GRI standards are in the public domain. You can go use your phone, get on the GRI website, you download the standards, it's free to use. You don't have to pay a cent. It will cost you an internet connection, that's it. It's the same for UN Global Compact principles. It's out there, you've got case studies, you've got a lot of examples, start somewhere. So that's from a practical sense, where you start that sustainability reporting journey. You need to have a direction, that's your guiding star, principles, 10 principles, what you shouldn't, what are the boundaries for your organization, how you treat people within and outside. What is what are your future plans? That's going to be your guide. That's going to be what drives what you measure over the years and what you report on and what standard you pick to ensure that that data is of very high quality.
Thank you. So we'll move now to the last topic of greenwashing. We hear more about investigations concerning greenwashing scandals and companies being taken to task. So among the recent ones, we've heard of the BNY Mellon investigations in the US, Goldman Sachs in the US, DWS in Germany, and the common thread in all three investigations relates to the misrepresentation and omission of information about the decision-making process and also the management of funds. And this kind of leads us back to the idea that the financial sector is still somewhat paving the way concerning best practices in ESG. And it sheds light on the importance of regulation, which will cover in the first topic, and picking the right reporting standards in the second topic. So aside from reputational risks, what other concerns do you think greenwashing would present?
Well, I think the most recent situation that we've seen is where activists are taking companies to court and holding them liable, and the Dutch court has shown that it has the desire, the will, and the power to hold a private company accountable for pollution, and that's Shell. I'm not here to bash any company. I also have a car, so yeah. But that's what's happening. It's not just a reputational risk, and reputation is revenue for all businesses. So businesses with a purpose, businesses who commit to sustainability first need to understand why. What is the reason why the CEO wants this? Does he just want integrated reports to look good? So he's going to delegate that to someone else? Or is he taking that as his mission as a leader of an organization that has people working for him, yes, but livelihoods that his business is going to sustain, dividends that his company is going to pay? So that the reason why they do it is very important, because most greenwashing situations, it doesn't come from an intention of destroying the planet. It comes from an intention of either they tried to look good or they made a mistake. So greenwashing is not just reputational risk, and the reason, well, one way of going about it, of making sure that you protect yourself, a firewall, is to have sustainability reports that are consistent. When you make a mistake, when you don't have the resources for something, you talk about it in your report. You make that information available and transparent to all of your stakeholders. But yeah, reputation is revenue, as I said. It's not the only risk. You've got litigation risk. You've got all kinds of risks that can arise from greenwashing.
Thank you. Let's see what Pascale has to say.
Talking about greenwashing, it's true that in the financial services industry, greenwashing is a significant concern because governmental bodies and regulators are conscious that investors must have confidence in what products say about their green credentials. So confidence, investor protection, and market integrity are impacted when these scandals emerge. And somehow linked to reputational risk, I think greenwashing can lead to massive litigation risk, i.e. the risk that a firm is sued by a client or an investor, or even by an activist group who claims to have been missold or just wishing to obtain press headlines. Thank you.
So we've also asked Pascale, what can companies do to mitigate these allegations of greenwashing?
One approach that could add value and mitigate greenwashing claims would be to create an ESG oversight committee. And this could also add to reconcile data before publishing. Also, companies can adopt a comprehensive approach for integrating greenwashing risk identification and greenwashing risk management across the entire operations, considering existing governance, product development, sales, and pricing processes. On the reporting aspect, I will tend to say, be transparent in your reporting. And lastly, I think companies should understand the obligations in a fast-changing regulatory environment. So they should seek legal assistance where required, and also they could consider independent auditing of their ESG data reporting so as to obtain third-party assurance of their ESG data. Thank you.
So with that concern regarding greenwashing, Janesh, do you think that regulation would be the answer to this or not?
Definitely. What I do think is we need to have a sectoral approach when we are talking about greenwashing allegations. So if you take the Securities Act, you have sections 80 and 82 of the Securities Act, which actually have criminal and civil sanctions, which actually specifically target misleading or deceptive statements in prospectuses or private placement memorandums. So, also it is interesting to note that we also have the FSC guidelines on the issue of corporate and green bonds, as well as the Bank of Mauritius guidelines on the issue of sustainable bonds that both apply to what I would say securities in general. Also securities, I'm talking about equities, bonds and debentures, etc. But I think the focus needs to be more on general goods and services. Why I'm saying this? Because it seems to me that general goods and services, in terms of regulation at least, seem to be the poor child in Mauritius. So if we take an example, Consumer Protection Act, I think this is where the legislator really needs to spruce up the legislation, at least the Consumer Protection Act, where additional protection is required to be given to customers regarding general goods and services. And it is not a secret that actually producers, sellers, etc., they would actually move where there is more profit, they are profit-oriented, and these days, more eco-conscious trends and socially responsible products and services, we can see that on all shelves in the supermarket. So we need to have something actually which really ties in and caters for that particular, those particular types of goods and services, because sometimes there is definitely greenwashing in there. They do not purport to say what they're actually selling. A good starting point for the legislator in Mauritius would be to have a look at least maybe to the CMA, which is the Competition and Markets Authority in the UK, which has actually come up with a very interesting guidance on environmental claim on goods and services. So the guidance actually proposes 6 very clear and simple steps that a manufacturer or reseller can actually adhere to comply with their consumer protection law obligations. I think this is actually what Mauritius needs. So on the security side of things, the corporate side of things, we are fairly okay on that. So where we need more immediate attention is regarding general goods and services.
Thank you. So to round off this panel, I'll ask Evita and Hannes, where do you see the future of ESG heading, and is Mauritius on the right track?
I'm just going to, following Janesh's comment, I think, and I like to use this as an example, and fortunately I have this example to use. That's a new law in Mauritius against single-use plastic. It's recent, it's innovative, it's in keeping with global trends against plastic. But what it does is it encourages single-use bioplastic, which our government seems to think is a solution to single-use plastic, but it's in fact worse. So who's devising those legislations and how? It's like when you write the standards, who wrote the standards and how did they come about the standards? That's very important. It's very important to know what do you do when you've got legislation like this that is encouraging everyone to write biodegradable on their plastic bottle. What do you do as a responsible company? So we have to look beyond legislations into international ESG landscape to find a solution, to find the answers. So what we did at where I work is we've taken a stance against bioplastic. And I've got, I don't know, hundreds of suppliers harassing me to buy their biodegradable straws, which are imported from somewhere else, made from sugarcane, I don't know what. There is no transparency on the development of those products, and that's being endorsed by a counterproductive legislation in Mauritius. So yeah, the ESG landscape, where is it going? IFRS and GRI are working together, so all of this is going to come from the financial side, and I think unfortunately money still dominates everything. That's fine, it's fine to love money, but it's coming from the CFO side. They will have to take responsibility, because the reality in every company is that CFOs don't care about sustainability. It's only the sustainability person that takes all of that burden, and that the company looks good, yeah. But no one knows there's only one or two people who are actually writing these reports. So when we involve the CFOs, I think that's going to make a lot of difference. And CEOs listen to CFOs. So I'm very happy, yeah, Orison and GRI will be working together. They'll be mapping what are the gaps on each side, and they're going to come up with a very robust standard. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think ESG has got a long journey to go. I do think the financial, those who have or are responsible for money are the ones that are really being held accountable. Because everyone that starts a business typically needs financing to build a business. Everyone needs access, and it's always cheaper to borrow than to use equity in a business sense. So I do see ESG as becoming a bigger mainframe and drive. I mean, what we report through to all our investors, and particularly the UK, we don't just put money with the company. We have to show that we've implemented ESG at the most granular level in that company. And that's policies, boards, committees, reporting, reviews, sub-policies of sub-risks. All of that has to be fully disclosed. And so the interesting thing is, so BlackRock that controls 10 trillion, or the PRI that's close to 20 trillion sitting as a whole, which is basically all investment managers, banks, asset managers belong to the PRI. One drives that process, and so I think it's going to become more and more mainstream. But still, how does a bank who lends a client money enforce that? They'd have to take their staff force and grow it by 5 times. Then bank charges would go up. That means it will become affordable to lend. And so there's this subtle balance between enabling economies and enforcing ESG. And it is a very subtle balance when you look at the dead economy of it. What we're trying to do as investment professionals is, we get asked the question is, please can you show us what performance there's been in the IRR of a company because of ESG? That's the level we're being asked to look at it now, to say, well, you've taken 100 million, you've put it into this hospital, you're doing this, can you show how ESG has improved the IRR? And we're struggling just to report on the standards, let alone the economic benefit of ESG. But that's coming. So I do think it's here to stay in a big way. I do think companies are going to have to become familiar with it. And the only thing right now is read. I mean, people must just read. The standards are all there. Whichever standard you use, in particular, I always come back to the IFC performance standards because there's not a standard that doesn't reference the IFC performance standard. And the IFC performance standard is not a reporting standard. It's how do you go about doing what you do in ESG. It's the physical application, not the GRI. I can run through all of them. They all reference the IFC performance standard. Every single one of them. Every single one of the GRI, SASB, TCFD, CDP, all their codes are referenced back to the IFC performance standards. Because that's a practical application for a business to say, and if anyone wants to gain an understanding on ESG, that's the starting point.
Thank you. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your very valuable insights. We'll move now on to Janesh's panel on fintech and financial inclusion. So we'll have a 5-minute break first, then we'll move on to his panel.